Hello, everyone. I'm George Roska.
And I'm Mark Schneider.
And we want to welcome you to today's episode 174 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system, including the society that's waiting for them if the status quo goes unchallenged.
That's right, George. I think we're going to have an interesting conversation today. The question would be, what is the status quo in Western civilization? And I think if Americans ever wanted a good signpost, all they had to do is watch the opening ceremonies of the Paris Olympics. I think, as I was, many Americans were shocked by what they saw.
Definitely.
Just by way of remembrance, there was a parody, ostensibly, of the Last Supper. And in the middle of this parody was this blue paint-coated figure who represented the Greek god Dionysus, otherwise known as Bacchus in Greek mythology. And this particular figure was known as the god of winemaking and sexual fertility. He's known for freeing people from their moral constraints, from any oppressive constraints. And if people follow him with devotion, he is actually said to possess them and empower them for, exploiting their sexual appetites. So this is what the organizers at the Paris Olympics decided to showcase at the beginning of this competition for all the world to see. And obviously they thought, well, this is fine. Everybody's really going to enjoy this. They're going to identify with this. So we thought it would be interesting to talk about what this means for Western civilization. We hear this term culture wars a lot. It's a term that goes back to a book that was written by a man named James Hunter back in, I think it was published in 1991. It was called Culture Wars, The Struggle to Define America. And but actually, the culture wars began much earlier than 1991. You can trace them back to the 1960s and the sexual revolution.
And that led to a lot of other things, because we saw from the 60s Christianity being removed from public schools kind of systematically. It started off with removing prayer from the classrooms. It moved, that spilled then from the 60s into the 70s into, popular culture, continuing to push on the abortion side with the Roe v. Wade in 1973, and it just kept on going. In fact, by the end of the 70s, we had already, this is probably peak Cold War, a lot of, lot of escapees from former communist nations coming here, and one of the most famous ones was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and he gave his famous, Harvard speech in 1978 about, basically live not by lies. But he was already telling the West how blind they were to what was awaiting for them if they would continue down this path. So
that's right. Solzhenitsyn obviously is known for being imprisoned in a Soviet gulag for many, many years. From that experience, he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, and I think it was 1978 that he came to the United States and gave this famous address at Harvard University entitled A World Split Apart, where he was warning the West, not just America, but all of Western culture about what he saw as a spiritual decline that could lead to the kind of repressions that he experienced in communist Russia, in the Soviet Union. And I remember, George, you're probably a little young for this, but I remember in the 1970s, this man named James Dobson came on the scene, and he started Focus on the Family and the Family Research Council. And Dobson at the time, in my mind, was a voice crying in the wilderness. He was warning on his weekly radio podcast of what was happening in Western civilization, and particularly education, which is close to our hearts.
Yeah.
About the demise of culture and what he saw if this was not challenged. And then in 1989, Alan Bloom came out, a famous University of Chicago professor, came out with his famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, where he said that all incoming freshmen to the university, there's one thing that he could rely on. They either said they believed or they did believe the truth was relative. So even by the late 70s, the success of secular humanism had already taken root.
Yeah, and that then, really affected the next generation, the 90s, the early 2000s. That's when I came on the scene. And I can tell you my experience, especially in public education. But boy, oh boy, did things change once the triple threat started to really invade in the public education system. And that's really my younger siblings and their generation, and then my kids who are in, elementary and high school right now. So it seems like with every generation, these wars, these culture wars are increasing. And it begs the question that you're asking today, Mark. What kind of a world are we handing off to our children?
Yeah, what comes next? I mean, that's really the question. And I think maybe to get some insight into the answer to that question, we could look back on the culture wars and see some of the battles that were fought early on and what happened in those battles to give us a glimpse of maybe what the future holds. And George, I think we should suspend any judgments, any value judgments on these events, what's happened. But let's just talk about some of these, starting with the sexual revolution. And that this occurred in the 1960s. Everybody remembers Woodstock, even if you're not old enough to know what that event was, you've probably heard of it.
Oh, yeah.
This famous thing in New York State where people went topless and was expressing their sexual liberties.
Free love.
Free love everywhere. Well, what's happened since the sexual revolution? I don't think it's controversial to say that there's been a decline in what used to be known as the nuclear family. A mom and a dad, married, raising children together. And we saw a radical change in the nuclear family beginning at the end of the sexual revolution, starting in the 70s. For example, California was the first state in 1969 to pass no-fault divorce laws. Since then, I think some 40% of first-time marriages now end in divorce. Over 60% of second marriages end in divorce. And once you get to third marriages, it's like 70% plus. 3/4. And the other repercussion is that people just aren't marrying. 73% of marriages, and it's I take that back. 60% of adults aged 18 to 44 now cohabitate. They're not even getting married. Over 67% think living together should have the same rights as marriage. And it's even worse in the black community. 40% of all children born to unmarried are born to unmarried couples today. In the black community, it's 69%. So again, suspending any value judgments, regardless of what maybe you think this is a good thing for society, it can be tied directly back to the sexual revolution.
Yeah, all we're saying here is that these are some of the statistics of the fallout of the decisions that the society made back then.
That's right.
And we get to look back in history and judge, too, those repercussions. I think for our listeners, Katie Faust has a wonderful book on the topic of family and parents' rights versus children's rights. And she actually heavily focuses on children's rights. And based on the statistics that, Mark, we just pointed out right now, one of the biggest losers in all of this is children.
Which, of course, raises the issue of abortion, which before 1973 was not legal in most of the country, of course. 1973, the famous case Roe v. Wade made it a constitutional right. Well, abortion was something that was only mentioned in hushed circles. I remember, actually, George, and I'm going to date myself here, being in high school, and there was a friend of mine, and she became pregnant. And this was a real controversy in the community. and she had to travel out of state to receive an abortion. And, people just didn't talk about it. It was covered up. Whereas today, over 70% of the American population is in full support of so-called abortion rights. Even since the collapse of Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision, we're still aborting about 1 million children per year. Since 1973, George, 70 million children have been aborted just in the United States.
Say alone. What?
So again, suspending value judgments. These are 70 million American lives that could have been that are not with us today. Quite a dramatic result. And not only that.
And when I think about that, Mark, just sorry, real quick, that could have been a person who discovered the cure for some cancer, right? Could have been an engineer that found a more efficient way to design bridges to save us, a bunch of money on capital infrastructure, right? I mean, the potential that we've lost as a nation, we're doing this to ourselves.
And there's an emotional hit, too, from the acceptance of abortion. We have to remember what actually happens in an abortion, unless it's very early, unless you take the abortion pill. Once the fetus develops, we're talking about going in to the womb with instruments and literally ripping that child apart and sucking it out of the womb with instruments. So this is a very violent thing that's going on, hidden away. And yet at the same time, this is one of the consequences. Over 70% of Americans still support this. Another consequence of this, George, is that people aren't having kids anymore. The American population, but for immigration, would be falling precipitously. We know from demographers that it takes 2.1 children per family, per woman, to sustain an economy and in a country. America, I think, is currently at about 1.7 children per family, which means a falling population. So we're not going to have enough workers to support our economy. And again, suspending value judgments, this is just a reality of decisions that we made decades ago.
Yep, and decisions that most of Western civilization is making kind of unanimously here together. They're all, joining on this, and Elon Musk ramps about this on X a lot because he's looking at basically population collapse, and what that ultimately means for humanity. Obviously, he has other stray thoughts and rabbit trails that he goes on. But again, like you said, Mark, here's the decisions that were made in the 60s and 70s, and here's what we're facing statistically today.
Another signpost, the changing attitudes on homosexuality. Like abortion back in the late 60s, early 70s, George, this was a taboo subject. Of course, homosexuality is as old as humanity itself, but it was a very small percentage of people, a very small percentage that actually practiced homosexuality and sort of came out with it. And even then, it was highly controversial. Well, George, that has changed so dramatically. In 2003, the Supreme Court eliminated sodomy laws that had been on the books for most of American history, and that was the case of Lawrence v. Texas. The next year, 2004, Massachusetts started toying with same-sex marriage. Then 4 years later in California, we had famous Proposition 8 and the war over traditional marriage, which led ultimately to 2015 and the Obergefell decision, making same-sex marriage the law of the land. And of course, it didn't stop there. With the removals of taboos on homosexuality, this launched the entire LGBTQI plus movement and counting, where now children can decide themselves whatever gender they want to be, or no gender at all. And we must remember, George, there's no scientific basis at all for these decisions. This is a metaphysical claim now that Americans have decided to endorse, again, since the culture wars in the 1960s and 70s.
And what we're also seeing, Mark, is as a repercussion of this, polyamorous relationships, are starting to ask for their rights. So if same-sex marriages are allowed, why not, polyamorous relationship, who want to get married? And Massachusetts is also pushing the boundaries on that as well. And so now that just opens up, I think it was Clarence Thomas in the dissenting opinion on Obergefell that basically warned America of opening up this Pandora's box.
And he wasn't the first one. I remember when Proposition 8, which was for traditional marriage in California, it was actually voted to retain traditional marriage by a 52 to 48 percentile. And then the Ninth Circuit got a hold of it, and it was summarily turned over. And one of the dissenting judges in that case, I can't remember his name, he warned that the future of this could be polyamorous or polygamous marriages. Because once you state that people of different sexes can get married, if they have a constitutional right to do this, then why can't groups of consenting adults also get married legally? If love is love and it's just about what people decide to do together, why stop at just the union of two people? Why can't you include more people?
Love is love becomes, another way of saying it just comes down to consent.
That's right.
That's all they care about.
That's right. And of course, it didn't stop there, George. Now we actually have instituted across the country what is called gender affirming care. So no one would have dreamed of such things 20, 30 years ago, that we would have clinics that were encouraged by the public school system where children could decide what gender they were and start receiving puberty blockers that, if they're on long enough, leads to sterilization, and then get on cross-sex hormones and ultimately go to a clinic where they have genital mutilation surgery to try to change their body parts. 5 years ago, there were no gender-affirming care clinics in the country. Now there are hundreds of them spread across the land. Again, suspending all value judgments. We're just talking about what has happened in the last 20, 30 years.
And what's interesting, Mark, is, you laid out this trail where generation after generation is denying metaphysical realities. And now at the tail end of what you're talking about is they're denying physical reality itself. With all of this, like, I'm born in the wrong body, or there's no male or female, it's infinite, sexes and infinite genders. It's crazy when you follow it. This is the logical end of denying those realities.
Another area, George, that has happened since the culture wars began is, I don't think anybody can debate that we've experienced a loss of liberty in this country. All you have to do is look at the lawsuits against bakers in Colorado, in florists in Washington State, Jack Phillips, Barronelle Stutzman, conservative teachers like Jessica Tapia here in California that was terminated for refusing to go along with gender preferred pronouns in the school district. These are people who were brought up on civil lawsuits against rights that we've taken for granted in the United States since the inception of this country. Now these rights are in serious question. Moreover, George, we have started to institute what are called hate crimes. So we've never seen this before. This is a relatively recent thing. Whereas if you commit an assault against somebody, there were certain penalties that you faced depending on the severity of the crime. But what hate crimes do is now there's an added penalty depending on what protected class you're committing the crime against, which means we're valuing some people or groups of people more than others. So if you commit a crime because you don't happen to like, gay men, then you're going to get an added penalty to your crime rather than just the underlying crime itself.
Well, and Mark, we've suspended judgment, right? But we're also seeing where everything leads, right? So what, from this status quo, where do you think that the future is going?
Well, we just looked at 5 areas where we've seen the results of the culture wars. Let's look at another 5 areas, and maybe we can forecast where things are going if the status quo remains unchallenged. And the first one is republicanism yielding to a sort of majority tyranny. Now, the founders of our country, George, they put in a republican form of government to check, majority rule. In fact, the founders all had great antipathy for pure democracies, a 50% plus one rule. They believed in what were called unalienable rights that were, embedded in our Constitution. The most well-known ones, of course, is the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. And regardless of what the majority thinks, these rights are going to remain intact. The majority can't decide, well, we don't think you should be able to speak this way, or we don't think you should be able to practice your religion in this way. And since we're a majority, we're going to eliminate this right. No, the founder said these things are precious. They're given to us by God. Our Constitution is going to protect these. Well, that now is in real jeopardy. More and more Americans are coming to believe that, no, the majority should rule. We should have a right to have our will be the law of the land, regardless of what the Constitution says. And we've seen case after case that have supported that thinking.
Yeah, and most of our leaders in power talk more about saving our democracy than saving our republic.
That's right. And now the current administration is talking about changing the composition of the Supreme Court itself, which has arguably been the last bastion of protection against our unalienable rights. Well, if you change the composition of the Supreme Court, that may go away, which is going to lead to sort of a majority tyranny. Another conversation that's been ongoing for years now is changing the Electoral College. If that goes away, then it'll change our whole senatorial system as well.
Well, there's a second area, Mark, that you think is going to also change, and that's this whole new religion of paganism that will become state orthodoxy.
Yeah,
what do you mean by that?
Well, this isn't new with me. Last week, of course, we interviewed John Daniel Davidson, who's the author of the book Pagan America. And he makes a very good case that paganism is already sort of the new religion in America. And it's just beginning to take hold. But you can see this now in the Biden administration, for example, the changing the meaning of sex in Title IX of our Civil Rights Code, government and corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion organizations that have swept the country. Again, these are based on metaphysical claims that your gender can basically be whatever you want it to. And then we have, George, in California, the passage of AB 1955, which basically says that parents don't have a right to raise their own children in the way they see fit, that the government can step in and decide to hide certain things regarding gender identity in the public school system from their own parents. I'm going to read a quote from the French philosopher Chantal del Sol, which John Daniel Davidson quoted in his book Pagan America. Chantal del Sol has written, "Our morality is post-evangelical, but is no longer tied to religion. It dominates the television sets. It inhabits all the cinematography of the age. It rules in schools and in families. In short, we have returned to a typical situation as paganism. We have a state morality."
Wow. This is just blowing my mind right now, because the French and their philosophers, I despise heavily. But it's interesting how how he's really, accurately placed his finger on the issue.
I think he has.
Wow.
I think he has. You mentioned earlier, George, another area is the eventuality of polygynous and polyamorous marriages. I think it's just a matter of time, unless something dramatic happens to turn back the clock, that we will begin to see in different states toying with this idea where we now have group marriages. So you have to understand, the repercussions of this. Love is love. Adults can do what they want. But when you bring children into this situation, this is a very volatile mix. Imagine a child being brought into a group marriage composed of different men and different women. Or, even today where children are being raised by homosexual families, that child, again, suspending any value judgment, is forever deprived of a mom and dad, being raised by a mom and dad, whether in a biological home or an adoptive family. That has a consequence for society. You may think it's a positive consequence, but you can't deny the consequence itself.
So here's another place, and this is a dark place, Mark, and you have it here as your fourth prediction, and we're already seeing it in many, many states. And what's really troubling is that actually teachers' unions are supporting these kind of laws, and that's lowering the age of consent. Children, because of Alfred Kinsey and all of his male and female report on sexuality back in 48 and 51 that he published, basically makes the claim that children are sexual from birth. Therefore, they have sexual rights. Therefore, if we as a society impose certain laws on them, we are depriving them of their human right. What do you think is going to happen to these age of consent laws?
Consent is becoming its own authority. We see this being played out in the school system today with gender-affirming care, with double booking system in the public schools, with laws like AB 1955, where the children are being given the power of consent to change their entire identity and get medical treatment in accordance with that identity. I think we can expect, George, that this is going to continue on. Once a child can make this kind of decision to change their body parts forever, perhaps, what's to stop that child from making the decision to have a sexual relation with an adult, with a non-minor? It's hard to argue against that. And the courts and college white papers are spending a lot of time writing about the dignity of pedophiles and the effort that they're making to express their dignity in being able to have relationships with minor children.
But it's interesting how they're trying to reframe the words, no longer, pedophilia, but minor attracted persons.
Minor attracted persons, yeah. Ellen Walker in 2021 wrote her book, The Long Dark Shadow, Minor Attracted People and Their Pursuit of Dignity. Again, George, this is a metaphysical claim. It's not based on science at all. But this term dignity and autonomy we see in court cases across the nation to support abortion and also same-sex marriage. So we're going to see it again in the age of consent being lowered for adults to have sex with minor children.
So under, and this is the fifth point here, as these ideas have progressed and the repercussions that we've mentioned in society, ultimately, this new form of orthodoxy, this paganism, will require a bending down of not just your knee, but your mind to everything.
We're talking about thought crimes, essentially. And we talked about hate crimes. Thought crimes is the next step. And it's already happening in certain parts of the world. There was the case here in the United States of Mark Gheorghe, who was defending his, I think it was a 15-year-old child who was being accosted by an abortion supporter outside an abortion clinic, I believe in Pennsylvania. And he just protected his son. And as a result of that, he was put on some kind of a list. The FBI got involved. The FBI raided with some 25 members of a SWAT team his home in the early morning hours where his wife and some 5 children, where he was arrested. He was fully acquitted, but just based on him defending his child outside of an abortion clinic. But even more frightening, George, was in the UK, in England, a woman named Isabel von Spruce was simply praying silently outside of an abortion clinic in the UK. And the police there noticed that she was just standing there. She wasn't even praying out loud. It was just a silent prayer. And she was arrested based on UK laws forbidding that. So this is quite chilling. But once again, when you remove the Judeo-Christian worldview, when you remove unalienable rights, this is the kind of thing that you can expect when majority rule is now in place.
Well, the devil himself is afraid of prayer. So, Mark, this all seems very dark for our children, but what can we as parents be doing? And just as, adults, citizens, grown-ups, what should we be doing?
Well, there's a lot of things, but let's just talk about 3 in particular. I love the book that Rod Dreher wrote, Live Not by Lies. George, we have to resist the deception that's going on in our culture. It's just not true that a man can decide to be a woman and a woman can decide to be a man, or that you are no gender at all, and force the rest of society to endorse this metaphysical claim. There's no scientific or other ontological undergirding to support such a thing. And yet, American society just goes along with this. We have to stop doing this and say we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to say no. That means, George, speaking up. I love the quote by Martin Luther King that said, "Our lives begin to end the day we stop speaking out about things that matter." Americans need to start speaking out. And then finally, George, you need to be very careful on who you vote for. It's not enough to vote for the person who just happens to identify with what you like. You need to do due diligence and to go into their voting record and use some critical thinking and discover, what do these people really believe in? Is it going to lead to a better country? Or is it going to lead to the kinds of things that we've been talking about on this program?
Yeah, and there's some really good resources. One website that I'll throw out there is biblicalvoter.com, and it has voter guides in all 50 states that people have done the research on people's, voting history and habits, and they, do like a star rating, how closely they align with Judeo-Christian values. And Mark, the last thing I'll say is about Live Not by Lies, Rod Dreher's book. I also like a very similar book called Renaissance, written by Os Guinness. And the subtitle of that book is called The Power of the Gospel, No Matter How Dark the Times. And I've read that book multiple times. And every time I fall into this semi-depression, as a pastor, like, well, what's going on with this world, Lord? Or why aren't you making things right? I always pick it up again and let, Oz critique me and and say, no, George, get back up and just continue praying and continue preaching the gospel and continue speaking the truth, as Rod Dreher says. So.
I can't endorse Os Guinness more. I encourage everybody to pick up that book. It's a great book. Well, George, I think we're going to have to leave it there for today. We hope this has been helpful to our audience, and we look forward to seeing you on the next broadcast of Say What.